And we are back on Sportsman Radio. I'm your host, Chris Shanafelt, and I am now joined by Football Insider for TSN, Mr. David Naylor. Thanks for joining me. How's it going, Dave?
Busy week in Atlanta, Georgia today. Been doing the Chicago, Boston, Atlanta route on lots of NFL. Busy time for the National Football League.
Yeah, man, I'm a huge Chicago Bears fan, and let's get right to it. You are very familiar with new head coach of the Chicago Bears, Mark Trestman, from his 5 years coaching in the CFL for the Montreal Alouettes, and he's been very successful in Montreal, appearing in 3 Grey Cups, winning 2 of those games, winning the 2009 CFL's Coach of the Year. Dave, what can you tell us about Coach Mark Trestman, and do you think he'll be a good fit for the Chicago Bears?
Well, I think the first thing you have to know about Mark Trestman is put him in some context. When a coach comes from the United States who has never coached in Canadian football, there's not a very good track record of success, which is why people are skeptical. I mean, you can be a great football coach and know the game, but the Canadian game is very different. And so when Mark Trestman was hired 5 years ago, a lot of people said, whoa, this isn't going to work. Because, the head coaches in the CFL, whether they're Canadians or Americans, most of them are Americans, they climb the ladder the same way they do in the NFL. You're a position coach, then you're a coordinator, then you become a head coach. To step in and be a head coach in the CFL takes a lot coming from the United States. And yet Mark Trestman was able to adapt right away. The first thing, he was respectful about what he knew and what he didn't know. He learned the game. He was incredibly detail-oriented. He was very focused, I think, on the things that he had to be in order to be successful, identifying those things that he needed to learn and adapt to. And then he put his quarterback skills to work with Anthony Calvillo. Now, to be clear, Anthony Calvillo was a very successful quarterback before Mark Trestman got there. And the Alouettes have been a successful organization before and during Mark Trestman's run. So it wasn't like he took over a team that was a disaster or an organization that was on its knees. But what he managed to do was continue the level of excellence that they had established, and I think take Anthony Calvillo to another level, through his quarterback mentoring. So, in terms of how all that will translate to the National Football League, look, I think Mark Trestman had the X's and O's credentials to be a head coach of the National Football League before he ever came to Canada. He was there for 17 years. Look at the players he worked with: Rich Gannon, Steve Young, Bernie Kosar, and others. What he couldn't get, and he was pretty clear about this in his news conference this week, was the opportunity to demonstrate that he could be a head coach, that he could be a leader of men. And that's what the Canadian Football League afforded to him. And look, he's not a guy who's going to get in your face and scream. He's not a guy who's going to use fear and intimidation. He's going to demand excellence. He's going to give players an opportunity to be successful. He'll be, I think, direct with them when they do step out of line. But that worked for him in Canada. The only thing he never really faced, and we don't really know how he would deal with, was a lot of adversity. He never had a losing record. They never had long losing streaks. There wasn't a lot of pressure from adversity that Mark Trestman had to deal with, and that's something that could come his way in the National Football League. So that is kind of the one thing that, how will he deal with it if the Bears are 2-5, is maybe the one thing we never got to see in Canada.
Dave, I'll tell you this right now, that I have not watched a single game that has been played in the CFL. You said that the CFL and NFL, they're pretty different. Can you tell us their differences? And is it the talent? What's the actual difference between the NFL and CFL?
Well, we could fill a whole show talking about this, but I'll give you the highlights. Look, there are the fundamental things, right? You play a 110-yard field that's 65 yards wide. You got 20-yard end zone. So, if you're first and goal from the 5-yard line, you can drop back and throw a 30-yard pass, right? The defense doesn't really, the space doesn't contract when you get into the red zone because you've got 20-yard end zones. The defense lines up a yard off the ball, which obviously makes, 1-yard play a lot easier. You've got 3 downs instead of 4. So while in American football, a 4-yard gain is a successful play, in Canadian football, it's not. You've got motion, unlimited motion. So you can run, there are teams that run 6 receiver sets that have everybody running towards the line of scrimmage at the snap count. Those are kind of the highlights. The more subtle things that you wouldn't notice when you turn on a game is, there are lots. Look, most of the players in the Canadian Football League are not good enough to play in the NFL. But there are some NFL players that don't fit this league. Those big, wide, fat defensive tackles who go, 330, 340, those guys can't play in the CFL because there isn't really a role for a run-stuffing nose tackle who can't go sideline to sideline. So there's a different type of player. You see running backs that are smaller. You see linebackers that are the size of safeties. It leaves, because there's more space to cover and it's not as much of a power game. You are looking for smaller, faster, more agile players a lot of times, and less of the kind of guys that can just out-muscle somebody. So you're sometimes looking for a different type of player. I mean, there are players that are phenomenal Canadian Football League players that could never play in the NFL. And there are some average CFL players that get a shot in the NFL. And again, sometimes they're good in both leagues. When Cameron Wake was in this league, he was as good a defensive player as I've ever seen in the league, and he's carried that on in the National Football League. But the other thing is, from a coaching standpoint, you have to have 20 Canadians on your roster. And the supply of Canadian football players is not as big as the supply of American football players. So knowing how to hone and develop Canadian talent, knowing where to play your Canadians as opposed to your Americans, those are the kind of things. They call it the ratio. Knowing how to manage the ratio. The clock at the end of the game is completely different in the final 3 minutes, where you've got the clock stopping on first downs. You've got 20 seconds between plays instead of 45. So, I mean, there's a multitude of differences that wouldn't jump out at the average fan who's just turning on a game. But if you had a coach on the sideline and manage all this stuff, then you're in a different world.
Dave, it seems like Mark Trestman was a liked coach around the CFL. Do you know how most of the CFL and Montreal fans felt once they heard Trestman will be going to the NFL?
I think they felt okay with it, because it wasn't like he was there for 1 year. He was there for 5. I don't think there's a sense that he came and used the Canadian Football League just to get somewhere else. And he was clear, when he was asked about watching NFL games, he said he didn't watch any till the end of November, because he was absolutely focused on doing everything he could to help the Montreal Alouettes. And he would watch games that he had taped in the off-season. But I think people are okay with it. He was respectful to the city of Montreal. He was respectful to the ownership. He mentioned the general manager in his address yesterday, Jim Popp. And I think people say that he gave them 5 years of his very best. I think people are pulling for him. I think they feel that he did Montreal proud, and I think people have been expecting this. It's pretty widely reported that he was a finalist for the Indianapolis Colts job last year. He'd been rumored for the University of Miami and other years. I think people were kind of understanding that at age 57, Mark makes I think a pretty decent salary in Canada by the standards of regular people, but by pro football head coaching standards, he's going to make a lot more money with the Chicago Bears. And the opportunity to sign a 4-year contract, make that kind of money in his late 50s, take care of his family, everybody understands it. I think everybody wishes him well.
You guys are listening to Sportsman Radio. I'm your host, Chris Schanfeld, talking with Dave Naylor from TSN. Dave, Coach Mark Trestman has coached some really good quarterbacks. You named them, Boney Kosar, Steve Young, Rich Gannon. Do you believe Mark Trestman can help Jay Cutler reach his full potential and become an elite NFL quarterback?
Yeah, I think he can. And again, Mark has a very calm, measured demeanor. I don't think you're going to see screaming matches between Jay Cutler and Mark Trestman. Or let me just say, I think it is less likely. He's not a guy who, explodes. He just kind of, when you talk to him, everything is sort of so calm. And I think you guys saw that yesterday. I mean, even I remember, one time, when Chris Leak, the former University of Florida quarterback, was in a game for Montreal as the backup, and they scored a touchdown, he went into the end zone and did the gator chop. And watching Mark respond to that later, it was like, he was speaking in such sort of measured tones, and you could tell he was furious that he'd done that, because he thought it was disrespectful to go in and do your college symbol in the end zone of a pro game. But, again, the way he came across and dealing with it was, extremely measured. So I think, again, because he is a science of quarterbacking, because he has the credibility, that's the other thing I think that helped Mark in Canada. People knew this guy coached in a Super Bowl. People knew this guy worked with Steve Young. So the players in Canada gave him that respect. I think Jay Cutler is going to give him that respect as well. I think you look at the comments that Jay Cutler made and the fact that he was in on the process. And it's not clear whether he had a veto on it, but certainly if he'd given his feedback and said, I don't connect with that guy, I don't think, his style of offense and the way he sees the quarterback position is going to be good for me, you've got to think that would resonate with Phil Emery. So, again, that's what Mark does. I mean, even the last year, he worked with Jay Cutler, I believe, in 2006 before the NFL draft. He worked with Brandon Brandon Whedon last year before the NFL draft. He worked with Jimmy Clausen and Tim Tebow before their NFL draft. So, he's been a quarterback teacher. He's been a mentor. He's going to call the plays, so there's not going to be a disconnect between the guy who's working with him on fundamentals and the guy who's putting. And the other thing that I think you heard Mark say many times in that news conference is that he's going to protect Jay Cutler. And that's certainly been an issue in Chicago during the times he's been there. And it was an issue in Montreal before he got, the last season before Mark Trestman got to Montreal. Anthony Calvillo, again, who was a guy who's entering his late 30s, was getting beat up. And under Mark Trestman, that offensive line was tremendous. And Anthony Calvillo was protected. Again, who's a guy who turned 40 last season. And it's interesting, one of the coaches, I don't know if this is confirmed yet, but I've reported that it's likely, one of the coaches that he's expected to bring with him from Montreal, Pat Meyer, who was their offensive line coach last year and was recently promoted offensive coordinator, he's coming to the Bears. I know that the players on the Alouettes have said he's the best offensive line coach they've ever dealt with. So, the guy who was entrusted with that role in Montreal is going to have some hand, I'm not sure what his job title will be in Chicago, in trying to help get that done with the Bears as well.
Yeah, I have high hopes for Mark Trestman and the staff he's bringing in. I'm really liking these names that he's bringing in. Cromer, DeCamillis. I mean, he's bringing in some really good guys, and I'm really liking what I'm seeing. Dave, I have a question for you from Andre on Twitter, and he asked, do you know if the tight end position plays a big role in Trestman's offense?
He used it more than most. There are a lot of CFL teams that don't use the tight end at all. Again, because you have the wider field and you don't run as much, sometimes that tight end in the CFL just becomes a slot receiver, which they do sometimes in the NFL as well. I mean, Tony Gonzalez, you see, lines up in the slot sometimes. He's not necessarily lined up on the end. But Montreal used the tight end role more than most. The tight ends that when you do see them in the CFL, they tend to sometimes line up as decoys. They had a tight end by the name of Ryan Bombin, who I think came into the league as a defensive lineman, and they use him a lot in those goal line situations, where he'd sneak on the field, line up on the end, and the next thing you know, they're throwing a touchdown to a guy who's got a defensive lineman number on, that kind of thing. And again, they did use him a fair bit more than most people, but you didn't see the kind of use of the big athletic tight ends that are going to be among your leading receivers, which you're starting to see, and I've seen for a while in the National Football League. The Antonio Gates, the Heath Millers, the Tony Gonzalez. There aren't players like that in the CFL. It's more of a niche role. But I say, especially in the latter part of the season, Trestman did use those players more than most people in the Canadian Football League.
Yeah, because the Bears, they don't have the greatest group of tight ends with Kellen Davis, Matt Spaeth. I certainly hope they hit the draft with the tight end. Dave, you were in Chicago for Trestman's press conference on Thursday, correct?
Yes.
How was the atmosphere like in Hallis Hall with all the media and workers welcoming Mark Trestman?
It was funny. It felt like a very kind of joyous day. And look, maybe it feels like that every time as a new coach. And I expected a little more skepticism than I encountered. I mean, I was really interested to see what the line of questioning was that he was going to receive. And I thought it was fairly friendly, and I thought it was fairly positive. I thought Mark did a good job answering the questions. The curiosity about his Canadian Football League background came up, but I think people have had enough time to get educated in the last 4 or 5 days since his name popped up in that Jimmy Johnson tweet to understand that this is a guy who, he's not Canadian, he's American. He worked in the NCAA, he coached in the National Football League for 17 seasons. It's not like they're bringing down a guy who, he's going to have to learn the 4-down game. I mean, he knows the 4-down game. So I think those kind of questions had all been kind of answered before the news conference. But I thought Mark looked like a guy whose lifelong dream had come true. I mean, his whole demeanor, I got to say, was a lot more lighthearted and kind of happy than we normally see him. And I think that's not so much being in Canada, being in Chicago thing, as it is that's an in-season, out-of-season thing. My experience, when you meet football coaches out of season, they're a lot more relaxed, easy-going than they are when they're in the heat of battle week to week. But I thought Mark, came off well, and I thought that it seemed like a very proud day. Look, I think it's a high-risk, high-reward pick, okay? Phil Emery, the general manager, picked the guy that he think is the best to unlock the potential in Jay Cutler and help the Chicago Bears win. But he had to be aware that if this doesn't work out, especially if it doesn't work out right away, there's going to be a different kind of criticism than if he'd hired Bruce Arians. I mean, Bruce Arians has worked in the National Football League recently. He was an interim head coach this year. People aren't going to say, what were you thinking? If Mark Trestman comes out and struggles, there's going to be a lot. It's Phil Emery who's on the line here personally. You hired a guy who hadn't worked in the National Football League for 8 years. Hey, maybe we see why this guy never became a head coach in the NFL in 17 years before, despite having a lot of success with some great players. That's the kind of skepticism and criticism that's going to come his way. I'm sure Phil Emery is aware of it, but he disregarded it. He doesn't care. He's sticking with what he thinks is the best choice, not the one where the criticism is going to be the least if they struggle, as all teams struggle at sometimes, or most do.
17 years as an offensive NFL coach, 5 years in the CFL as a head coach for the Montreal Alouettes. Chicago Bears hire Mark Trestman as head coach. Dave, I really appreciate your time and excellent insight. Hopefully we can stay in touch. I'd love to have you on the show again in the future. Before I let you go, is there anything you'd like to plug on the air for our listeners?
Well, it's funny. The one thing I thought that was interesting, just one last thought, was how we've always wondered in Canada whether or not Mark's accomplishments in the CFL would matter enough to an NFL GM to get a job. And the most interesting thing in that whole news conference yesterday was that Phil Emery, who said that the fact that he came and adapted to a league he didn't know in a city where he didn't speak the language, the primary language there is French, and had success right away, really resonated with him. So while we've often wondered, well, hey, it's the CFL, or Mark's accomplishment is going to matter as much to a GM in the NFL, Phil Emery looked at it differently and said, hey, the fact that he had success going there and had to learn and adapt, that's what coaching is about. That means it seemed as much or more than Mark having success in the National Football League, which I thought was interesting. But if your listeners want to check out TSN.ca, I am, among other things, as a broadcaster, I'm a regular columnist on there, and I may have a thing or two to write about Mark Trestman in the coming weeks and months.
Sounds good. Thanks again for your time today, Dave, and hopefully we stay in touch, and take care, my man.
My pleasure. Take care.